On Halloween of 1988, 6 teenage boys ventured into a tunnel on a local railroad. Only one escaped with his life and a photo. What resulted from that innocent venture was a 2-year period of unexplained murders, which killed off a good 10% of my small town's population. To this day, no one knows the true fate of the 5 boys and the reason behind the murders that lasted until the fall of 1990. Except for me. I'm the lone survivor of the 6 who encountered the Wanderer on the tracks on that dark Halloween of 1988. It was supposed to be a simple dare. Nothing to it. Everyone had heard of how every Halloween, people head into the tunnel and never come out. We all thought it was bullshit. Then again, we were only 14 and not very well learned in the way of the paranormal. All we expected was just some crazy dude in a bedsheet. However, what we found was much worse, and what we did made the outcome 10 times worse than it could have been. I guess that curiosity killed the cat really fits when remembering this story. It was me, Steve, John, Andy, George, Bill, and Fred. Explaining our choice of costume is irrelevant. However, let us note that we all brought flashlights, and Andy had brought a bucket to collect candy in. Foolish Andy. I remember your death so vividly it haunts my dreams to this very day. And she does, too. But not for long. We all had dinner at John's house as it was the closest to the tunnel. After that, we played some Super Mario Bros. On his NES to pass the time until it was dark. When it was, we all departed to complete the dare we so foolishly accepted. I carried a Polaroid to show everyone what was really in the tunnel. We left when it was considerably dark outside. Most of the dads were parading their 7-year-olds up and down the street, getting candy before it got really dark. There had recently been some kidnappings in the area, but we didn't expect to meet the suspect, so we thought we would be safe. With each step towards the tunnel, it seemed as if it got darker, and when we arrived there, it was pitch black, and was pretty much only us and the other old trick-or-treaters outside. We all stopped at the entrance of the tunnel for a moment, realizing that we may not make it out alive. After waiting one more moment, we hesitantly stepped inside, turning on all of our flashlights. No one really wanted to do this. We felt this more and more as we went deeper into the tunnel. It was weird though. Usually a tunnel ended around 500 feet, but it seemed like this one went on for miles. We went on for what I want to say was another 3,000 feet. That's when we saw it. At the time, we had no idea what it was. If I had a choice, I wish that I never found out what it was and what it did. "The fuck is that?" Bill asked, half whispering to the rest of us. What we saw looked like a girl that had covered herself in dark paint, or makeup, and had on a plain old nightgown. She was holding what looked like a rod or staff. Her back was facing us. "Beats me," Andy shrugged. "Hey!" He yelled at the thing before throwing the bucket at it. It clanged off of the creature and rolled to the right of the track. Suddenly, it made the most gruesome noise in the world, as its head rotated 180 degrees to stare back at us. I hastily took out my Polaroid and shot a picture of it. I put away the camera and shook the developing picture before putting it inside my pocket. Everyone was frozen in place looking at the thing, seemingly paralyzed. Soon, the creature lifted the rod and threw it at Andy. It was horrifying and amazing seeing it throw what we now knew was a spear, with such dexterity as well as doing it backwards. The spear struck Andy in the chest, dead center in the sternum. His ribcage collapsed and blood sprayed from the entry and the exit. His spine snapped and he crumpled to the ground. The blood-splattered spear was stuck in the ground a good 40 feet behind us. It was only a moment before we actually thought to run. We didn't even try to save Andy. I turned my head and saw the creature ripping open his chest, tearing muscle and organs apart, as our dying friend screamed in his death throes. It seemed like the creature wanted to separate flesh from bone, as that is exactly what it had done. Andy's flesh and innards were scattered around his skeleton in a pool of his blood. It was coming for the rest of us now. Bill was the next one it caught, eviscerating him in the same manner as it did to Andy. Then she got George and then Fred. It was me and John left. The creature was so close we could feel its putrid breath on our necks. We both heard its demonic growls and screeches as we just barely escaped its furious grabs of our costumes. We kept on running even though the lactic acid had built up so much in our arms and legs, and our breath was ragged. We were so damn tired. Soon we saw the end of the tunnel. Somehow, it was morning, which was so illogical, but John and I were both happy to see the light of day. Suddenly, I heard a trip and stumble. John had fucking tripped. We were outside of the tunnel, and he tripped. I didn't even need to turn my head to know he would be gored and gutted. I ran a safe distance away behind some trees near my house. His screams echoed through the neighborhood and awoke several families, wandering outside to see what was happening. Everyone who went outside all saw the creature as it tore John apart. When it was done, it swept its eyes across the shocked citizens of my small town and let out a deafening roar that no man or animal could create. It then dashed back inside the tunnel, and everyone ran inside their homes, including me. For 2 years after that, the people who saw the creature were found disemboweled and skinned in their homes. Some people tried to move, but I heard them say it was like they were chained here. The creature was holding everyone here, keeping everyone who had seen it captive in this town. I'm the last surviving person who saw the Wanderer on the tracks, and my time is coming soon. How did I last this long? I don't know. I bet it's teasing me, torturing me, making me shit my pants every time I turn a corner. It's taken a hold of my life, and I can no longer function like other people. I can no longer go out in the dark. My windows are always closed, the blinds always down, the doors always locked. I've tried to kill myself multiple times, but I can't. It won't let me. Recently, I've been hearing the screams of my dying friends. I've heard a bucket clanging from outside my window, tapping on my front door at night. It's a sign. It's coming for me soon. It was in my 27th year that I first came upon the house, hiking alone in the Alder Creek forest. The locals told me there was an old abandoned village deep in the woods, in a village whose prosperous years ended some 100 years ago, when Shiniko became the leading wool producer of the area. As a result, no one needed the wool from the town of Alder. Same thing happened to Shiniko a few years later when people found wool cheaper elsewhere. I'm now 39. I hope... I'm in a desperate need of what I might find out there because my wife has become ill. Only for her would I ever think of venturing in those woods again. Only the love I have for her. I'm scared. I'm trembling even as I write this, but I must get over it, as night is passing quickly, and soon it shall be time to go. It was a bright and sunny day when I entered the woods. I was feeling quite optimistic about my journey. I was using a map I found in an old book called Ghost Towns of the Northwest. I mentioned the town of Alder, but I've never actually found Alder. I got lost and got way off track, miles and miles away from any known civilization. It was getting near full dark when I came across something peculiar. All the way out here, deep in the woods, where no man would need to wander, I came across a freshly carved jack-o'-lantern. It was a deformed jack-o'-lantern which was taller than it was round, much like a human head but larger. It was oddly shaped and more bulbous on the left than the right, which made its single-toothed smile look like the grotesque rotten mouth of an elderly man who has suffered a stroke. Inside, I could see something shining. My curiosity got a hold of me and I bent down for closer examination. The first thing I noticed was how the eyes were shaped unlike any eyes I've ever seen carved into a pumpkin. Each spot where an eye would be was made of 4 holes, giving the pumpkin the appearance of having 8 eyes. After examining the mouth and then the eyes, I looked at the nose with more focus. Then I noticed some movement behind the nose. I realized what it was, but it was too late. Spiders quickly ran up my arm. I ripped off my coat and threw it as far as I could, then started wiping off the remaining spiders from my arm. And then I stopped, stunned to see that the top was being raised from the base. The next spider, girth similar to that of a baseball glove, covered in orange slime and pasty seeds, had to squeeze out of the pumpkin, it was so big. The spider spun around and looked at me. I must have run 2 miles before I finally felt safe enough to stop, but only long enough to catch my breath. I headed in the direction I had come from, and as soon as I could, I started running. After a short while, I came across a camper sign. The sign told me after 3 more hours of hiking, I would be back to where I entered the woods. I had only walked maybe 100 feet more when the fog rolled in all around me. I would be a fool to try to find my way back through the fog, so I gave up on trying to make it out of the woods that night. I would wait until morning, then walk out of the woods and try to forget the image of that giant spider. I set up my small tent and climbed inside. Right before I went to sleep, I remember thinking, God, please don't let that spider find its way to me. I woke up in the middle of the night when I heard a sound much like a door being slammed. Was I that close to the road? Was I so lost that I'm nearly out of the woods? I put my tent back in my pack and headed towards the noise. Luckily, the fog had lifted, and at least for a moment. I started to think that maybe it was all in my head until I saw a light in the distance. An orange light. And then I could smell a fire. The woods were on fire. They must have been. I'm way too far out in isolation for there to be someone else out here. But of course, there was that horrible pumpkin someone had carved out. I walked slowly in the direction of the fire. Step by step, I listened until I got just outside of the clearing in the blaze of the fire. The fire drew my attention for a while. Its heat felt good on my now coatless upper body. As I stood there warming my hands, I noticed some weird things around me. There was a chair made from a log with the back support made from twigs nailed to the log. Behind the big flames of this bonfire, I could see a house. Well, perhaps a house is missing the finer details. I walked around the tree line to get a better view of the house. It was very old, architecture I had never seen before. The roof was completely flat and the house had more windows than walls. Windows that gave away the edge of the building. Some of the cracks in the windows were filled with dirt. The place gave me the creeps and a feeling of dread swept over me. I was ready to leave the place when I saw more jack-o'-lanterns. I shuddered at the thought of the spiders they might contain. Instead of running, I found myself approaching the house, thinking that maybe the occupant could help me find my way out of these woods, or at least provide a shelter for the night where I wouldn't have to worry about such a twisted environment. Before knocking, I decided to peek through the window. Inside was nicer than I would have imagined. It had old furnishing, but not as weathered as the outside of the house. An antique collector would be ecstatic to come across such a find. There was a beautiful old couch and chairs, both covered in velvet, with detailed carvings in the wood and what looked like a solid oak table inside. But what really drew me in was an old truck. It was covered in a pale leather that resembled the color of skin. It wasn't made with the same craftsmanship of the other furnishing. The seams were tacky and went all over the place. I was about to walk to the door when I saw the inhabitant enter the room. The man looked as old as the leather, with skin that looked just as leathery. He had unkempt hair and an even longer beard. The right side of his face was sloped just like that pumpkin. He walked over and opened a trunk, and inside, it was full of gold and silver coins. I stood there awestruck until he turned to me and smiled, revealing one tooth and 8 eyes. I've never been so scared in my life. A moment later, extra 2 arms and 2 legs sprung out of his body, tearing apart his fake skin and revealing him to be another ugly black spider. I ran fast enough to win an Olympic medal. When I finally got out of the woods, I was miles away from my car. I never went back for that car, and I never went near those woods again. I hitchhiked out of there and spent the next year drinking, trying to get that image out of my head. I know bigger men would have gone back for all that gold. This happened at my friend's house a couple years ago. It was the first time she'd thrown a big party like this for Halloween. A couple of my friends and I ended up spending the night there. Because no one was in any shape or mood to drive home at 2 in the morning, we crashed in our living room. The house was small and it only had 1 floor. The living room is to the right of the front door, lots of windows and a big pond out in the front. Everything else is an empty field. Adjacent to the living room was the dining room and kitchen. To the left of it, you've got your classic creepy hallway, complete with an old rusty mirror at the end of it. There was about 7 of us total sitting in the living room, when all of a sudden, my friend stopped, claiming she heard a noise. So she and another one of the guests went down to the hall to have a look as the rest of us continued to doze off. That was, until they came running out, shutting the curtains and turning off as many lights as they could. They urged us to do the same. We shut all the curtains and turned off every light in the house, save for a couple of flashlights. That's when our lovely hostess started handing out steak and butcher knives for protection. At this point, the rest of us just wanted to understand just what the fuck got them so upset. Apparently, they had gotten halfway down the hallway when one of them noticed a movement in the corner of their eye. She looked into the office, the first door on the right which faced the front of the house, and there was a handprint on the window. This would only seem a little odd, but the handprint was on the outside of the window and had never been there before. Mind you, this was a small house. We were partying all over the place. Someone had to have been outside in the last 10 or 20 minutes to make it. The only other problem was that the window in question was elevated 2 meters off of the floor. As far as I'm concerned, no one at the party was 2.5 meters tall. By now, all of us were thoroughly freaked out about the fresh handprint, except for me. Me, being oddly disinterested in freaky shit, went outside to see the handprint. That's when I realized how tall you actually had to be to make a handprint at the top of the window like that. I figured no one else had noticed yet. Besides, scaring people who were all holding steak knives is a stupid idea. I went back in to check on everyone. They considered calling the cops, but the house wasn't made with a working landline, causing the reception to go to shit. I decided to calm everyone down and try to convince them that some guy got proper plastered and just hopped up to slap the window like that. Since no one had considered the height of the window, they believed me all the way to the next morning. When everyone went to sleep that night, I didn't. I ended up staying up because I knew the one thing that I hadn't told everybody. I knew the truth, and I figured I should be awake in case there was a break-in. I had to use the bathroom earlier that night, and I found a similar handprint on the bathroom window, which happened to be at least 0.5 meter higher than the one the others had found. When I walked outside, I realized that half the windows on the front of the house had handprints, but to this day, I think I'm the only one who had discovered that.